to Robert.
Thank you, Carl, for that great overview. Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Latour. I'm from Pratt & Whitney, one of our technical fellows there. And in my 19 years, I've been able to work in manufacturing positions, quality positions, and in engineering positions, and see kind of the cross-functional aspects of APQP that Carl just was talking about. And I've spent the last decade really focused on the deployment of APQP and PPAP at my company. So it's really great to be here with this group to talk about this. And, as Carl said, we went on this flight path through APQP cycle, and we've reached our first destination, which is entering phase 5, where we've achieved our production approvals. But as you know, APQP doesn't end because we've reached production. Our journey's not over, our program doesn't end. And we're going to be monitoring our performance to the original targets that were set out for the program. We're going to be looking at how we're performing to our customer requirements, how are we performing to our business metrics, safety, quality, delivery, cost. And based on all this performance, we're going to be doing continuous improvement. And so what I'm going to be talking about is how does APQP and PPAP support that continuous improvement, and how do we manage that change through an APQP cycle? So if we can go to the next slide, I wanted to really continue the concept of this flight path that we are on, but in the concept of managing a change. So, when you're in production, you look at your performance and you identify opportunities for improvement. These could be opportunities in actually changing the product, a new design to meet a customer need, modification to an existing design to maybe improve on a shortfall, or it may be making changes to the production processes. Carl walked through, there are supply chain transfers from one facility to another, from one supplier to another. We may be looking to insert new manufacturing technology, a brand new process that wasn't done in the past, or maybe more basic process modifications. We're changing some parameters, changing some sequencing, refurbishing tooling. All of these change situations require a cycle through the APQP process. And the reason for it, while we make changes with the intent of improvement, right? We want good things to come from these changes. That's not always the case. Sometimes a change just doesn't work, or it may not fully be implemented well. And sometimes there's unintended consequences that could be negative and hurt us in the long term while we're trying to do something good. So there's risk involved in every change. And so we need to work the APQP to identify and manage those risks to give us the best chance of success going forward. So with every change situation, when you're launching a change project, you need to first lay out the flight plan, right? The P in APQP is planning. And so we need to put together that plan up front. And the way we want to walk through this is starting out with what are the applicable phases that we're going to need to look at given the change situation that we're dealing with. And on these slides, I've pulled the tables from the RM reference manual, and to help you navigate how to think through these changes and what you may need to do in your business to manage the change, right? So in the table, the first two columns deal with product changes, right? The two white columns there. So a new product design or a design modification. And what you see is it's stating that we're going to need to look at all 4 phases of APQP for that type of change. Right, with a brand new design, you're going to really go through design and development. You're going to have to look at your manufacturing process, design and development, to how it fits that new design, and then ultimately go through a validation phase and get relaunched back into production with the new design. Now, when you get to a design modification, you're still going to need to go through the 4 phases, but this is where the concept of configuring really comes into play. Right. Carl talked about it as a menu, and we're going to pick the right things from the menu. And you can really look at it the same way here with this modification thought process. I need to apply the 4 phases of APQP, but I'm going to apply them in a way that is scoped and configured for the specific modification that we're making. All right, we're going to focus in on what is actually changing about this design. What development needs does that modification drive? What manufacturing processes are potentially impacted by that design modification, and therefore, based on those product and process design development needs, what validation may need to take place in the modification. Now, as you move further to the right on the table, you get to those green sections, which are the non-product changes or process changes. And the first thing you'll see is not all of the phases are applicable. Right? If we're not changing the design of the product, we don't need to go through phase 2. We're going to focus in on phases 1, 3, and 4 and look at how do those need to be configured for the particular non-product change or process change that we're dealing with. Okay, so if we're starting and transferring to a new facility, right, we're going to need to really focus on what is the scope of the manufacturing that new facility is taking on. Is it the full scope of the value stream? Is it specific process steps? And we're going to configure the design and development needs based on that type of scope. Same thing with new products, new processes, or modified processes. And we're going to, again, configure all of the phase activities to the scope of that change, and which is why you see that. The bottom line is we need to start out each project with laying out what is the flight plan, what is the full phase of activities, which helps tell us what are the resource needs, what is the cross-functional team we need engaged to make this change successful, and then what does the configuration of those phases look like so that we can properly scope the timing and resource needs to execute that change successfully. Okay, so and then we can go to the next slide. Once we understand what phases are needed, we can then start laying out the waypoints, right? We can plan out the waypoints that we need to take, which is in the form of the APQP and PPAP events that Carl talked about. And just like the phases, these are going to be applicable and configured to the scope of the change that we're talking about. So again, for new product designs, we're going to be looking at really the full scope of events that may need to take place, but configure those events to what that design is. Is it a single component? Is it a system of components? We're going to scale the events to match what is changing about that new design. When you get into manufacturing changes or process changes, again, we're going to look at specific events that are applicable to that change and configure them to what we need. So if we're modifying, say, a process, going to put together some new parameters, trying to make a quality improvement, we're certainly going to need to do a kickoff and understand the feasibility of does this concept of the new parameters match what our customer requirements are? Are we going to have potential for impacting other characteristics of the product? Do we need to take that into account as we're doing our planning, which will set us up to go into our production readiness? And I think you flip sides on me. There you go. Which will lay out the plan for what kind of development we need. Are we at the state where we're fully defined the process? Are we at the state where we're ready to move on into initial process studies and ultimately get into first article and production approval? Right. So again, we want to look at what events need to take place. What is the timing of those events given those phases that we're executing? And then how do we need to configure those events to match the scope and scale of the change we're making? So the larger the change, the more events and the larger, full scale and configuration of those events that you're going to need. A minor change or a smaller change, you may have less events that you need, and you can configure them down to match the scope of that particular change and focus on the risks that change is bringing, to the full value stream that you're worried about. Okay. And then we can go on to the next slide and really talk about now the detail, between the events, which is the actual activity in APQP and PPAP elements that you're going to execute. Same concept that we're going to, continue on again. We're going to look at what is the applicability of the elements that we're going to execute, and then how do we configure those elements to match the scope and scale of the change situation we're dealing with. And another table can, set up the same way, formatted the same way. The white columns are dealing with our product changes. So if you have a brand new design, the full elements are applicable, and they're going to be focused on what is that new design. And you get into design modifications, the full scale of scope of elements would be applicable, but now you're going to configure them down to the modifications you're making. Are you only impacting certain features or certain components? And you're going to focus on updating your file for those elements on those specific features. It was stated earlier that the APQP and PPAP files are living documents. And so that's what you want to be doing as you're working through these elements. You're going to be taking the file that was put together through your first APQP cycle and working through updates to those files to match the updates necessary for this new process or new product design, whatever the change situation is. When you get into manufacturing changes, again, you're going to look at what are the manufacturing elements necessary. So you could see in the green section of the table, the first block of elements at the top of the table are blank. And those because those elements are really related to that phase 2 or design elements. And we've already decided that that phase is not applicable for a non-product change. So those elements will not be updated and expect to be worked. However, as you get into the process, design and validation elements, you start to see the applicability come into play. And that's where the team needs to think about what is the configuration necessary of these elements to match the change that we are making. And it's important to think of these in terms of what is the real risk, right? The intent of what we're trying to do here is understand our risks and properly mitigate those risks as we go through this. As we're putting together these plans and we're executing the elements, there's a tendency to want to move quickly, right? We're making a change, we're trying to get the benefits of that change as quickly as possible, right? There may be a quality improvement, a cost improvement, maybe we're struggling with delivery, or maybe we have a customer complaint that we need to address as quickly as possible. So there's a tendency to really just try to get the change done and focus on only what you're dealing with in that particular improvement. And sometimes you can miss some unintended, influence that may happen when you're trying to make that change. I'm changing a parameter to fix a certain feature, and maybe another feature is influenced by that I didn't really think through ahead of time, right? So it's important to really go through these elements, and the concept is, sometimes you have to go slow to go fast, right? If we can go through these elements, do proper planning, execute them well, configured down to the scope of the change, we are going to be more effective in implementing that change, be able to implement it successfully, and once implemented, be able to see the benefits intended by that change. So, as you're going through this, you're going to be looking at, how does this change impact my process flow diagram? What process steps are impacted? Based on that impact, do I need to make any changes to my floor layout? Do I need to make any changes to my inspection plan? And then you're going to go through and update your file for your process FMEA. Looking at characteristics that are not only created but affected, and what are the potential risks given the new process, right? A new process means a new set of risks, and what mitigating actions might need to take place in order to manage the risks associated with that. And as you continue on, updating your control plan, looking at your new capacity, is there any changes to the supply chain that need to be managed? Are any of these changes going to impact your measurement systems? Or do we need to implement new measurement systems or change the measurement systems in any way, which may drive us into new studies? And then, it leads us into the validation elements, understanding what are our initial process capability studies and dimensional results to see, did the change do what we expected it to do? Are we getting the output that we expected, the capability that we expected? And based on that validation, we can go into the first article and PPAP approvals to get ultimately back to the end of our flight plan and launch back into production, with that change situation, effectively completed. Right. So, bottom line messaging in all this, first with any change situation, we need to have a kickoff with good planning up front, right? Quality planning, APQP is about planning. So lay out the plan, look at what phases are applicable, how do we need to configure those phases. Based on that, we can set our waypoints with the APQP events, set our timing plan for the change, and configure those events to match the scope of the change, and then execute our elements. Based on the phases and change situation, we can understand what elements are applicable. We can configure those elements to match the scope of the change, execute them, and get back into production with an effective change implemented and see the benefits that we were going after. Okay.